C-SPAN, the political network of record.
Now a Senate hearing on federal land acquisitions. This hearing was held by the Senate Energy Committee on Tuesday. Witnesses included Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt, Wyoming Governor Jim Geringer, and officials from the Forest Service and General Accounting Office. The GAO just released a study on federal government land. Wyoming Senator Craig Thomas chairs this hearing.
Call the committee to order, please, and we'll proceed with our hearing. Some of our associates are still in the policy meeting and perhaps will come somewhat later, but we'll go ahead and get started. Let me welcome you first of all and thank the witnesses for being here today. Especially I'd like to welcome the distinguished governor of my state, Governor Jim Geringer of Wyoming, who also happens to be the Western Governors Association's point person for land issues. It's my hope that we can examine three broad issues in this afternoon's oversight hearings. First, primarily through the testimony of the General Accounting Office, we'll examine the level and trends in acreage managed by the federal government land management agencies, namely the Department of Interior and the Forest Service. Secondly, we'll review how the federal government acquires land, including the federal government's use of exchanges. I'm especially interested in the success of land trades, and at this time of limited resources, how the federal government management agencies can use land trades to acquire lands they desire, either to protect unique natural features or to consolidate federal land ownership in order to facilitate land management. Third, I'd like to examine how we prioritize the use of financial resources. That is, in a time of decreasing federal budgets, how we can best manage the acreage already owned by the federal government. First, at the outset, let me tell you just a little bit about what this meeting is not about. We take an opportunity to say that this is not an opportunity to talk about selling off public lands. I strongly favor and actively support the notion of preserving and protecting unique areas. I also strongly support multiple use of public lands. But because the federal government owns 50% of your state, families and folks in our state need to have an opportunity to use these public lands in multiple use. Unfortunately, the rhetoric of the Department's Interior's news release yesterday mischaracterizes the purpose of this hearing. Shifting the debate is one thing, inventing new hearing topics is another. I hope all of us can stay close to the mark on the purpose of this hearing and provide constructive input. We have a governor, a GAO study on federal land ownership, and representatives of the departments charged with the management of this land. One would hope we'll have some solutions that we do not have during this hearing more misleading statements like that one in the release that came out from the department's spin shop yesterday. This oversight hearing is not a forum for debating how we arrived at where we are. Rather, it's an opportunity for us to examine how we best manage what we have. At present, the federal government is by far the largest landowner in the country. The federal government owns about 650 million acres, or 30% of the nation's total surface area. The four federal land management agencies, Department of Agriculture's Forest Service, Department of Interior's Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service are responsible for managing about 95% of the federally owned lands, or about 623 million acres. The vast majority of these lands are west of the 100th meridian. In my state of Wyoming, the federal government owns more than 30 million acres and nearly one-half of the total acreage of the state. Significance of federal ownership can be conveyed by this map of Wyoming that you'll see and the governor will refer to there. Majority of the colored areas on this map are owned by the federal government. Another item this map shows is the checkerboard land ownership pattern of non-federal and BLM land. The checkerboard ownership has some important ramifications for land use and developments in Wyoming and other states. Some in Wyoming would argue, and I agree, because of the magnitude of its holdings, the federal government has more control over land use decisions and the state's economy than the governor of Wyoming and other state elected officials. I want to stress that I support efforts to protect special or unique areas in the West and the need to consolidate federal land holdings for management purposes. However, I question the wisdom of continuing to increase overall acreage managed by the federal government. We have a time of limited budgets, an ever-growing mass of land holdings being acquired by the federal government. It's consistent with the oversight responsibility of this committee to examine the impact of that growth, the ability of federal land managers to manage these federal holdings, as well as to discuss options for increased efficiency, such as land exchanges. Let me state clearly that to pose the question and examine the growth of the federal government is actually a demonstration of my commitment to those reserved lands. We should all remember Yellowstone Park is in my state. I grew up in the county next to that park. I want to ensure that there are financial resources available for the needs of national parks as well as other preserved areas. Obviously, there's no blank check here. Unless we begin to set priorities, the federal land management agencies will not be able to manage any of the land as well as they might. Some folks even believe we're at that point today. So that's the purpose and the goal of this hearing. And Governor Geringer, we're delighted that you're here. Glad you were here with the governor's group and that you agreed to stay longer to join with us. So would you go right ahead with your statement, sir.
Thank you, Senator, and thanks to each of you for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm privileged to be able to participate in this hearing today to add a little bit of perspective to what federal land ownership means in Wyoming. And I thank you, Senator Thomas, for calling attention to that effect on not only the effect of Wyoming's economy and our people, but the effect on the United States. Senator Thomas, you made reference to a map that's here, and for those who are not able to see the map, who are toward the rear of this room, I invite you to come up later and observe the land ownership patterns that are on the map. The darker lines that are on the map denote the counties of Wyoming. The yellow colored lands are those that are designated as BLM, Bureau of Land Management lands. The light green shaded are the national forests. The purple area denotes the national parks, monuments, and the orange is the reservation for the Native Americans, the northern Arapaho and eastern Shoshone. The point of bringing the map along is to show the difficulty of what it's like to make policy decisions in Wyoming. During the 12 years I served in the Wyoming legislature, there were a number of advocates that dealt with policy and federal lands, state lands in general, and while the issue is not new, the voices have certainly become more strident that we need to find common ground on public land uses. The stridency is one thing that I believe serves a purpose only to a point, and then we have to work on resolution of the problems. It's important that the federal government and the state government then, in turn, work toward a method to find common ground. I would totally reject any notion that we're here today to offer up, as the paper indicated, a fire sale of state land or land ownership within the states. We are here to find out what we can do together to understand the impact on the economy and the management of our resources. Through a close partnership between federal and state government on federal land policy in our state, economic opportunity then does have a chance to catch up with the neighboring states. We certainly owe that to Wyoming's young people to make that happen. As an observation, Mr. Chairman, our young people do not always find opportunity for employment in Wyoming. It's a sobering statistic that 2/3 of our college graduates leave the state to pursue their own professions. Those who don't go on to college struggle to stay. They hold down minimum opportunity jobs, and we have an economy that should, although it does not always, provide jobs and entrepreneurial opportunities to allow our young families to prosper. The focus today for that economic opportunity will be the natural resources of Wyoming, because Wyoming has extraordinary potential for growth. In considering the natural resource base of Wyoming, I'd call your attention to at least seven major natural resource areas. First of all, coal. Wyoming is the leading coal producer of all the states in the United States. In fact, if Wyoming were a country, Wyoming would rank 3rd in the world in total coal reserves and rank 5th in coal production in the world. And certainly we rank 1st as the states among the United States. In the area of oil production, even with declining production on oil, Wyoming still produces enough oil to qualify for a membership seat on OPEC. Of course, trona. The delivery of trona to make soda ash to a variety of products that are value added. Wyoming is the world's leading producer of soda ash and indeed does provide 98% of our nation's soda ash production. Helium, that rare element. Wyoming has 1/3 of the entire world's supply of that lightweight gas. natural gas. We have huge reserves and other undeveloped and underdeveloped supplies that represent nearly 1/5 of the United States total. And of course with livestock, Wyoming is a national leader in production of beef and lambs. The area of water, the headwaters of nearly every western river begin in Wyoming. We are truly a watershed. The headwaters begin in Wyoming and go elsewhere. Now, this natural resource base would be the envy of any industrialized country in the world. You can imagine what the economies of Japan, Germany, or other countries would be if they had simply the resource base of Wyoming. Yet it does not, very little value added in Wyoming. As a state, we should be able to cause significant growth in our economy, and that certainly is the goal of any state as we assemble as the United States. We have the potential for growth, but we do not, in our state, control the allocation of those resources. Much of that rests in the hands of the federal government. As we look at the federal land ownership patterns in Wyoming, I ask you to consider the amount of mineral production that occurs on federal lands. I mentioned that we are the largest coal producer in America, yet 92% of our coal is produced on federal lands. 68% of all natural gas in Wyoming is produced on a federal land. 60% of all oil, 50% of all trona. All federal mineral production is administered under the Bureau of Land Management. But beyond minerals, the Bureau of Land Management also regulates hunting, recreation, agriculture, all with the land use policies. And the economy of Wyoming is further affected by policies of the Bureau of Reclamation, which regulates our major reservoirs and rivers. Without water, we don't have the lifeblood of the West. That in turn affects tourism, recreation, boating, fishing, hydroelectric power generation for our cities and our rural areas, irrigation, municipal water supplies. All these are affected by Bureau of Reclamation policies in Wyoming. Add to that the impact of the National Park Service, which oversees the major tourism magnets of Wyoming and the West. Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton National Park, Fort Laramie National Historic Site, Devil's Tower National Monument. Add to that the National Park Service policies that affect snowmobiling, automobile entry into the parks, bison management practices. That in turn affects livestock production, and impact there is truly significant. The Bureau of Indian Affairs affects our state and tribal relationships with two major Native American tribes with their schools, social and health services, water and minerals. And of course the Fish and Wildlife Service leaves its imprint in the management of the wildlife refuges in Wyoming, and for certain affects the recovery management of threatened and endangered species. The Minerals Management Service affects the quality of income Wyoming receives from federal mineral royalties by charging a substantial administrative fee for collection and enforcement. Now, these agencies are not the totality of federal policy and management, particularly on our federal lands, but, and I haven't even mentioned the forests up to this point, taking into account that these agencies I just made reference to, the one thing they have in common is that they all reside in the United States Department of the Interior. This is not directed at the current manager, the current secretary of the department, because it doesn't matter who is the head of Department of Interior, past, present, or future. That one person has more control over Wyoming's economy than anyone in the state of Wyoming, including your governor. We need to increase Wyoming's voice in resource management and to focus our resources on federal land policy. And Mr. Chairman, I would interject at this point that would certainly include your goal of blocking up portions of federal lands. And again, I make reference to the map, particularly along the southern route of the Union Pacific, where the checkerboard pattern of ownership illustrates how difficult it is to manage federal, state, private lands and make land management policy decisions. Well, the frustration with the allocation and management of public lands is not just as your governor, Mr. Chairman. The managers of the public lands are equally frustrated. Chief Jack Ward Thomas, who will address you later, when he addressed a natural resources conference we had in Wyoming this past December, recounted his frustration with the myriad of laws, court decisions, and case law that convolute proper management of the forests in Wyoming, as well as other forest services. And I'm sure that the chief will further elaborate his frustration today, because he has no clear policy on many of the resource issues he's expected to oversee. Minerals are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Wildlife are affected by the Fish and Wildlife Service. In fact, Wildlife decisions today have a greater effect on timber management than any other single factor, both for the chief's purposes as well as management of the state's economy. I would estimate, Mr. Chairman, that between half and three-fourths of our entire economy in Wyoming is affected by federal land policy decisions. The Western Governors Association have undertaken an effort to resolve many of the complicating and confusing issues in federal land policy. I, as the Governor of Wyoming, and Governor Kitzhaber of Oregon have agreed to a bipartisan co-chairmanship in an effort to review Western resource management. Our approach will include the convening of a Western Governors Policy Advisors in a Natural Resources Conference later this spring in Portland, Oregon, at which time we'll develop a strategy for consensus and legislative remedy that will benefit not only Wyoming and the Western states, but also the public trust responsibilities of the federal government. Given the local impact of economic and social policy, the frustration of the federal administrators in carrying out their responsibilities, and the obligations of the Western governors as part of public administration, I strongly support your efforts in the Senate to adhere to a no net growth policy regarding federal land ownership. And further, I strongly support your efforts to consolidate land ownership and to develop a more rational and reasonable policy for that public trust. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield to questions.
Thank you very much, Governor. Appreciate it. We've been joined by some of my associates. Perhaps if any of you have an opening statement. Senator Bingaman.
Mr. Chairman, I do not. I appreciate you having the hearing, and I appreciate the governor being here to testify.
Governor Craig, or Senator Craig, isn't it? Yeah, a little confused.
A little promotion.
Yeah, I suppose.
Well, I don't know how to handle that one, Mr. Chairman. I never really contemplated that idea. I'm pleased with the work I do here, but thank you very much. And Governor, let me thank you for being before our committee this afternoon. I especially appreciate the efforts of the chairman in looking at the sheer question of federal land ownership. Because for well over 100 years have had vast portions of public land in the West held by the federal government, managed by the federal government, assume that that's the only way to manage the land. I completed what is now the 15th hearing on the management of the Forest Service, and during one of those hearings we looked at alternative management forms. All of us clearly interested in the well-being of the environment, its quality, and all that it brings with it. But we also look at the fact that there are an awful lot of people out there who must make their living from the land. It is the base of wealth of our nation, always has been, always will be, and therefore how it's managed becomes critical. We discovered, many of us knew it, but at least the record showed a much clearer example of an alternative management form that heretofore has been largely ignored. It was 153 million acres of trust land managed by state governments under trust. We found out by the analysis of a variety of universities in their study of this trust authority that that land was managed every bit as well as the federal land for environmental purposes, and in many instances better. That they adhere to a lot of the environmental laws that the federal administrators like Jack Ward Thomas must adhere to. My point is simply this: that land is public land. That land has public access. That land is being managed very well by public entities, with one major difference. It is managed in almost all instances for 2/3 less than the cost of managing federal land. And it is managed under trust, and by that trust requirement is caused to be asked to make a profit off from its resources. And I found it interesting that that is something that we don't talk about as we talk about, oh my goodness, only the federal government can manage land, when in fact the federal government is one of 3 managers. State governments manage a lot of land, and the private sector of our society owns and manages the rest of it. And all of them do excellent jobs on the whole. So when we look at the issue of public land ownership or management in this country, let me have the visual aid that I wanted to bring that I think is important for all of us to remember. Everything in color on this map is managed by the federal government. Everything in color is managed by the federal government. In my state of Idaho, over 63% of the land is managed by the federal government, and therefore the policies that this committee and this Congress make on that land have a dramatic and direct impact on the livelihood of the citizens of my state. Your state, Governor, is a state with even a greater ratio or a very large ratio. I don't know exactly what your percentage is. My point being, and the point you just made, a no net gain of federal lands becomes very important to those states that have very little private property base to begin with. And that's what I've advocated, and that's certainly what the chairman has advocated. There are reasons and responsibilities for the federal government to, in some instances, own or move properties when there becomes a greater public need, and I accept that. But the idea that the only way we can manage the land is if the federal government owns it is to decry every bit of our history across the world where the federal governments of the world have ended up being the mismanagers of the land because they had no special interest involved in it, other than the grand generic interests. And certainly state trust lands have shown that we do provide alternative management forms that work very well where there is local input. The value of these hearings today is extremely important. I am one of those who thinks we ought to look at all the options. I've not decided that states ought to have these lands, but I really believe it is a head-in-the-sand approach, Governor, for any federal administrator or any citizen to argue that the way we did it for the last 100 years is the only way to do it today. We ought to be reasonable enough to look at all of the options and decide how best to do it to accomplish some very fundamental goals. And the quality of the environment is right at the top of those goals, as it always should be, because these are lands that we want to be around generation after generation after generation, providing us with the quality of environment that is so critical to our country, and at the same time continuing to provide us with our wealth base. So I thank you very much for being here today, and I thank the chairman so much for the tremendous effort he's put forth in looking at a variety of options and talking about ownership patterns and helping build on the record a high level of frustration that is building in the West today amongst our citizens who feel themselves tremendously encumbered by an increasing attitude on the part of the federal administrator that these aren't your lands, people. These are the lands of the federal agency that is involved, and only they are the ones that have the right to manage them, to make decisions on them, and to allow access by the public and by the citizenry. And I thank the Governor for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this conference.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Camel.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just also thank you for doing these hearings, and I want to associate with my remarks with Senator Craig's, and maybe just add to that frustration I think that many people face in the West, because I think many of them believe, as I do, that when you talk about the fiscal health of this nation, a good portion of that, if not all, is produced by new wealth. And a lot of that new wealth comes from the land itself, public lands. Whether you're talking about oil or gas or livestock or timber or minerals, it all starts somewhere with the land. Everything else, the wealth that's created in this nation, it seems to me, is either through packaging, through transporting, through processing, through trading, through doing a number of other things with the new wealth that came from the land. And those people, particularly in our western states, that rely on the jobs that are part of that providing of new wealth, I think that they maybe have a little different perspective about the intrusive, what they think is intrusive behavior on the part of the federal agencies, and that is not only the limits that they're put under from trying to provide for their families, but the limits that they see as putting a big dent in the providing of new wealth for this nation. And so I, as you do, coming from the West, I guess maybe we have a little different perspective than many of the people that deal with the public lands, but I know, as Senator Craig does, we see it every day on a first-hand basis, and I just want to commend you and thank you for these hearings.
Governor, do you think there's an opportunity to improve management by some trades among both state and federal, perhaps even private and federal, so that these lands could be blocked up into more manageable segments?
Mr. Chairman, I think one of the primary places to start is in those areas that are identified by federal analysis as areas of critical environmental concern. There are land ownership patterns that would lend themselves to preserving those critical areas and at the same time opening up other blocks and parcels of land. So exchanges are certainly a primary way to start. I think it's probably the least controversial way to start.
Have you seen in your experience much progress in terms of trades?
We have not seen much progress, Mr. Chairman, although we've initiated more activity of late than we've had in the past year. And that's with the focus of saying we can learn to work together, we can accommodate each other's mutual objectives, and certainly as Senator Craig pointed out, I think there's been a shift in attitude, at least at the state level, by the state directors and others who oversee the properties as that it's not their land, it's their obligation to oversee the administration of the land. And there's certainly a distinction, as you've correctly drawn, Senator. The ownership does not reside with the agency. The ownership resides with America and its citizens. Once we understand that position, I think we arrive at consensus a lot quicker.
The map is interesting. I think for those who are not particularly familiar with the land patterns in the West, it's useful to differentiate between those lands that have been withdrawn for a particular purpose, such as national parks, such as forest reserves, such as game and fish areas, Fish and Wildlife Service areas, as opposed to those lands that are basically residual lands that were simply there when the homesteaders completed their homesteading and have remained there, were never withdrawn for any purpose, generally don't have a unique purpose. So it's useful to recognize that there are two different kinds of public lands in the West.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I'd offer also, in addition to that, if you were to consider, for instance, the area around Jackson Hole, a very popular vacation spot, a very scenic place. It's a lush valley. It epitomizes the beauty of Western America. And quite often people will see that area as representing the entire federal ownership within Wyoming. But you get down in that southern area that's characterized here by the checkerboard pattern. Those are very arid lands. In fact, there's something called the Great Divide Basin right in the middle of southern Wyoming at that point that has no drainage. And it doesn't need to because there's no water that falls there anyway. That area is so dry that it takes 30 acres to support one cow if she packs a lunch. That, I think, also is a mischaracterization in many people's minds that somehow all of these federal lands in Wyoming or the western states are that beautiful, lush area that might be more characteristic of Jackson Hole or Yellowstone or indeed some of the national forests. As much as anything, we're trying to come up with a characterization that realizes the limits of the resource as well as the benefits of the resources, those that are marked by yellow on this map.
Thank you very much. Welcome, our associate, Senator Bumpers. Do you have any comments, sir?
Mr. Chairman, in deference to the fact that I'm late, I'll forego making an opening statement. I had a long one.
Congratulations. I appreciate your decision. Anyone have questions for the governor? I know he's headed back to Wyoming shortly. Questions? If there are none, Governor, thank you very much, sir, and we appreciate your being here.
Thanks to each of you.
Next, we'll ask those representing GAO to be here. I believe Barry Hill, Associate Director of Natural Resource Issues of the General Accounting Office. Mr. Hill, if you and your associates would come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Before I begin, allow me to introduce my colleagues. With me today on my right is Paul Grace, who is the Assistant Director responsible for leading the work that we have done and are doing regarding federal land ownership. And helping us out will be Sherry Casas, who is a member of the audit team and will be assisting with the charts that we have brought today. We appreciate the opportunity to be here to present information on the changes over the last 30 years in the number of acres managed by the 4 primary federal land management agencies, namely the Department of Agriculture's Forest Service, and the Department of Interior's Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service. More specifically, we will provide data for the following 3 areas. First, the percentage of land managed by these agencies in each state as of September 30th, 1994, which is the most current data available. Second, the changes in the total acreage of land managed between fiscal years 1964 and 1994, as well as some explanation for those changes. And third, the acres of land acquired by these agencies and the methods used during that period. Before I discuss each of these, may I point out that the information we are presenting today is based on data provided by the 4 agencies. Much of these data are preliminary and are based on ongoing work that we are doing for the chairman of the House Committee on Resources and Representative Richard Pombo. Moreover, we have not had the opportunity to verify the completeness, accuracy, or reliability of the data that we were provided. Let me now start by discussing the percentage of lands managed in individual states. As of September 30th, 1994, the federal government owned about 30%, or about 650 million acres of the nation's total surface area. The largest percentage of this land, about 96%, or 623 million acres, is managed by the 4 federal land management agencies. If you look at the first chart that we have prepared, you will see that most of the land managed by the 4 agencies is located in the western portion of the United States. In fact, for 12 western states, these agencies manage more than 20% of the land, and for 5 of these states, the agencies manage over 50% of the state's lands. Next, let me briefly discuss changes in the number of acres managed by these agencies over the last 30 years. From the end of fiscal year 1964 to the end of fiscal year 1994, the total acreage managed by the 4 agencies decreased from about 701 million acres to about 623 million acres. This decrease of about 78 million acres occurred primarily as a result of 2 unique land transfers involving 112 million acres of BLM-managed land to the state of Alaska and Native Alaskans. If you exclude these 2 large transfers, the overall amount by the 4 agencies actually increased by about 34 million acres. If you look at the next chart that we brought, you can see that the changes in the acres managed by the individual agencies. And as you can see, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service each experienced increases in the acres they managed by a total of about 119 million acres over this 30-year period. In contrast, the Bureau of Land Management, the largest agency in terms of acres managed, had a significant decrease in the acres it managed over this 30-year period by about 85 million acres if you exclude the 112 million acre Alaska transfers. The primary reason for this decrease was that it transferred about 90 million acres to the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service in 1979 and 1980. Finally, let me briefly discuss the acreage acquired by the 4 agencies during this 30-year period and the acquisition methods they used. If you look at the next chart, you'll see data from the 4 agencies that show that the agencies acquired title from non-federal parties to about 10.9 million acres during the 30-year period. Of the 4 agencies, the Forest Service acquired the largest number of acres, about 4.3 million, with the Fish and Wildlife Service acquiring about 2.9 million, the Park Service about 2.6 million, and BLM about 1.1 million acres. With regard to acquisition methods used, acres acquired through purchase, over 5 million, and exchange, about 3.3 million, accounted for the majority of the total acres acquired. Mr. Chairman, I summarized my statement, and I would request that the complete copy of the statement be submitted for the record.
Yes, it will be submitted for the
And this would conclude my statement, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you or members of the subcommittee may have.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hill. We've been joined since you began with some of our associates. Mr. Kyle, Senator Kyle, do you have any opening comment? Or?
No, Mr. Chairman, I know the witnesses want to get on with the hearing, and I'd be happy just to hear them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Burns?
I just have a statement that I'd ask unanimous consent if being entered in the record, and I'm interested in hearing from and reading what the witnesses have to say. I'm sorry I can't stay through the whole hearing.
Okay, thank you. Could you put that last chart back up, please? Waited until you got away from it before I asked. Mr. Hill, you indicated in your testimony that over 30 years there's been approximately 34 million acres added to it. But you identified 10 million, 11 million there. How did the other additional 20 million acres get into the picture?
Mr. Chairman, I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer for that. The data that we were provided really doesn't account for that 23 million acres. This was the best we could do in terms of accounting for actual acquisitions. A lot of the information, when you go back 30 years, a lot of the information is very historical. It was kept on manual records. The agencies are in the process of automating that information and providing it in a little more usable format. But it's very difficult to sift through there and really account for the 23 million acres. We were able to look through what records were available, and we do have some rough estimates. Please don't hold me to these numbers, but some rough estimates in terms of this 23 million acres. There were a number of land transfers from other federal agencies, such as the Department of Defense transferring land to the 4 agencies, and we think that's anywhere in the neighborhood of about 7 million acres. There was also land that was jointly held by 2 or more of the land management agencies that when they were jointly holding it, it appears that neither of them were really accounting for it in their inventory. Since then, there has been one of the agencies who has assumed the primary responsibility for this land, and that would now be reflected in their inventory and probably is part of that 23 million. And there was about 1.1 million acres of BLM land that they just did not previously inventory or account for, and they've just recently determined that they have that.
Just a couple million acres here and a couple million acres there. Yeah, are you surprised at that? Are you surprised as you did your work that there wasn't a little more accounting available to you?
Yes, quite frankly, I am surprised by that. For federal agencies that have the responsibility for managing and overseeing these federal lands, I was expecting that there would be a little better accounting of that at the headquarters level. I know it's a very awesome task. I know it's a very difficult task, particularly when you're dealing with historical archived records, to go back and reconstruct history. That's not always the way to do it. But I would have expected a much better accounting for it. And I must say, I've got to give credit to the four land management agencies. I think they're trying to do what they can now in terms of updating their records and keeping better track of that. And hopefully they'll be able to do that in the future.
It would seem to me that you would expect, despite the difficulty of historical information, that an inventory would be a pretty common thing to have, wouldn't it? If you were a land management agency, wouldn't you kind of expect to have the land that you managed inventoried and available? I guess you've already answered that.
Well, I can say, coming from the General Accounting Office, yes, we would expect that.
General Services Administration has a different set of numbers then.
The General Services Administration actually is responsible for maintaining the count, the inventory of the land. And when we tried to get the information from GSA, the records were so poor and the data was so unreliable that we just could not use their information at all. That made us go directly to the four land management agencies and obtain the information directly from them. And in many cases, when we were asking for information, they in turn had to go out to their district and state offices and get the information from the local areas.
Now, your inquiry was limited to numbers of an amount and trends of ownership, as opposed, for instance, did you take a look at all at how these lands might be managed, or how they were, what the ownership patterns were in the states, or that kind of thing?
Our current effort was limited basically to getting a handle on ownership and the trends in that ownership. But I must say, the General Accounting Office has done a large body of work over the years for all four of the land management agencies, including looking at various issues and topics concerning how these lands are being managed. And we've obviously issued some reports that discuss those things, including, and we found some problems with those, including, for example, the situation out at the national parks in terms of keeping up operation and maintenance, keeping the facilities top-notch, being able to handle the flow of tourists and visitors to the parks. So there's various difficulties that these agencies are experiencing in managing their particular facilities.
Senator Craig.
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe I have any questions of the GAO. I do appreciate these studies, and I think that it is critically important, Mr. Chairman, that we update ourselves on a regular basis of what the trends are and where we want to go on some of these managing efforts. I am pleased that the GAO is recognizing some of the difficulties that our agencies are having in keeping up facilities and managing numbers of people. I found it very interesting. In fact, this committee, I think Senator Bumpers played an important role in it, and others, and I was active. For those of you who go out to Mount Vernon, you travel out on a national park way and generally assume, I think many of our citizens do, that Mount Vernon is held by the Park Service, and it is not, of course. It's held by a private entity, managed by a private entity. But the concession area where the gift shops and the restaurant and those facilities are, including a post office, were once park properties. And they were so badly managed, the concessionaire constantly appealed to us for ownership so they could keep them up, to keep them in tone with what the American public expected. Park Service just couldn't deliver. And we were able to accomplish that through land exchanges and that kind of thing. And I live close enough that I watch that management very closely. And I've noticed over the last several years since it went into private ownership that it's been totally upgraded, modernized. It meets the standards that I think most of the tourists, the public of our country expect when they go to these fine old historic places and are served food and see concession shop. And I just use that as a microcosm of an example where in these instances, and I don't suggest all instances, but in this instance the Park Service simply could not move through the lengthy bureaucratic process that it has to work. Finally, when we got it into private ownership, it now works very well, and Park Service was a beneficiary because they are now the owners of more private property that is undeveloped. But those are of great concern to us, that many of these facilities that are very popular, like our national parks, and we want to maintain their quality and their environmental integrity, aren't doing a very good job of it because we simply do not provide the resources collectively as a country to meet those needs, and I don't suspect we would want to charge the citizens any more than they're currently being charged. That's a dilemma that we've got to face. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Bumpers.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions of the GAO. The charts you've shown here are very interesting to me. Those figures always sort of elude me over time, and it's good to realize again that the United States government's actually managing 623 million acres of land. I have very strong disagreements with the chairman of this subcommittee about federal ownership of land. As a matter of fact, I take great pride in the fact that since I've been in the Senate, I have almost single-handedly added 116,000 acres of federal ownership from private ownership, and hope soon in a land exchange with the Weyerhaeuser Corporation to add another 55,000. Now, since 1980, not very much increase in federal ownership has occurred. Is that correct, Mr. Hill? Isn't that essentially correct?
Since what period of time?
Since 1980. 1984, I'm sorry. In the last 10 years, federal ownership has not increased very much. Maybe not at all, I'm not sure.
I don't have that information readily available. Most of what we did was based on a 30-year period.
But let me just say that in the case I mentioned, Mr. Chairman, about my own personal involvement, the first time Governor Andrus, who was elected governor of Idaho in 1970, at the same time I was being elected governor of Arkansas, later became Secretary of the Interior, And 13,000 acres of really unbelievable pristine hardwoods became available from an estate. And the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission simply could not swing it. They wanted to make it a fish and wildlife. They wanted to make it a game preserve. And I called my good friend Cecil Andrus, and he had a discretionary fund. I knew he had $3 million in it, and he gave us almost $1 million that enabled us to make that purchase back in the late 70s. And it is something that everybody in our state, but especially the hunters and fishermen, are delighted that it's in federal ownership. Secondly, the Weyerhaeuser Corporation came to me several years ago and said, we're going to sell a lot of our interest in Arkansas, especially around one of the most pristine lakes that we have in Arkansas. And I knew that if they sold, it would be developed. I also knew that if it was developed, there's a very good chance that that lake, in which the fishermen of our state congregated to in great numbers, would probably wind up being polluted. We already had quite a bit of development around the lake. And so every year, for about 5 or 6 years, I was able to get a few $1 million to add a few thousand acres to the Ozarks and the Ouachitas, and until the budget constraints just prohibited any further appropriations for such purposes. But we were able to add 40,000 acres, a lot of it right around the dam, which in my opinion was just over it, flew over it about 1.5 years ago. It was the most beautiful timberland I've ever seen in my life. Belongs to the Forest Service. We bought it. We bought it to save that lake from being polluted, and I promise you, everybody in that part of the state was delighted that we did that. And then John Hancock had to foreclose on a large tract of land in Arkansas, and they offered it to the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, for a song compared to what they had in it, because farm prices had declined so dramatically when they took a loan, gave a loan on it. And the United States government put up about $2 million a year until we got $8 million and bought that. And it's one of the most beautiful and useful goose resting grounds in the United States. There are often as many as 400,000 Canadian geese on that area, and who believes for a minute that if we hadn't done that the hunters in my state would have been as well served. And now I'm right in the middle of hopefully a Weyerhaeuser. Don Nichols and Senator Nichols and I are in the middle of an exchange between Weyerhaeuser for lands that they own privately that they want to exchange for Forest Service lands. We've worked on this for 4 or 5 years, just like Senator Craig, we did on the potlatch deal. You remember what an ordeal that was. And so hopefully Senator Nichols and I will get that bill passed this year, and the federal government will acquire 180,000 acres in exchange for about 55,000 acres. And that's almost a 4-acre for 1-acre exchange. And I promise you the fishermen, the hunters, the timber people will all be euphoric about that, because they all promise to benefit forever. Not just temporarily, based on what the bottom line will be to the stockholders in the next quarter, but forever. So I make no apologies for having strong reservations about the bills of the chairman, with the utmost respect to him. I want it put on my epitaph, all the things I just told you. It'd take a long time to do it, but I'd like to have that on my
I'm not sure we have that large an epitaph. So, anyway, I just have to say that I don't disagree with you, and you've misrepresented my position somewhat. I'm perfectly in favor of acquiring those lands that have a particular value. But come to my state, where 50% of it belongs to the federal government. That's not the case in Arkansas. And there's a lot of it that could be traded, and that's the point that you appear to miss, Senator.
If I could, Mr. Bumpers, in answer to your original question to me, we got some information here based on a report we put out last January, and it seems like the total federally owned managed land for these 4 agencies held steady at about 700 million acres through most of 1984, and then from 84 to about 89 there was the drop down to the levels that we're reporting now, the 623 or close to it. So it does appear that's when the transfer of those lands did occur during that period.
There were 200,000 acres acquired in fiscal year '94. Senator Kyle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just relative to what you and Senator Bumpers were just talking about, there are clearly a lot of areas that we've wanted to add to various monuments, parks, and so on around the country, and I'm sure there will be many more. There are also situations in which some western states find themselves in some degree of stress. For example, in my first year as a member of the House of Representatives, I dealt with a problem in a small town in Arizona by the name of Payson, in a county in which about 3% of the land was in private ownership. 97% was in government ownership of one kind or another. As you can imagine, the property tax base was pretty bad. And in this one town, about 1% of the land was privately owned. And they had a school site owned by the National Forest Service, which we were able eventually to buy over a long period of time rather than having a fee continue to be paid, which was causing them a lot of money. So I think we can probably both cite situations in which we want to add to the public lands and situations in which it makes sense to have some acquisition of federal lands by private interests. And I guess the only question that I had really of our friends from the GAO, really two questions. First, are there any particular trends discernible here? If you discount the land relating to the entry of Alaska into statehood, what would you say the trends over the last 30 years are relative to acquisition or disposal of federal lands in a gross way?
Well, I think in our complete statement and in my short statement, I may have mentioned that if you exclude the 112 million acre land transfer, that the total acreage over the last 30 years for the 4 federal land management agencies increased by 34 million acres over the last 30 years.
And that's not that trend is not negated by the last couple of years, I gather.
There are acquisitions and exchanges of land that occur almost on a constant basis. It really is a moving target, and in a lot of instances, you have the Forest Service or one of the other agencies trying to buy up some in-holding land that's within a designated a national forest or a national park. You also have additional lands that are being set aside for wildlife refuges and things like that. We've identified a number of reasons, I guess you could say, for acquisitions, and it really relates, I guess, to that 10.9 million figure that we're reporting in this last chart. Most of these acquisitions, as you can see, are by the Forest Service, with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service basically getting the bulk of the rest. Many of these acquisitions are being done to establish new areas or new units, such as parks and historical sites. I believe over this 30-year period, there were 23 new national parks designated. There were 50 historical sites. There were 190.
I'm sorry, 50 or 15?
50.
50? 50,
50 historical sites. 192 refuges that were established. In many instances, these lands are being acquired to expand existing areas or units, such as the wildlife refuges, and as I mentioned, to acquire in-holdings. I might also mention that the acquisitions will continue. We have information that indicates that the 4 agencies have planned acquisitions in the future amounting to about 11.8 million acres that they plan to acquire. Most of this land, about 6.2 million acres, will be the Fish and Wildlife Service, and 4 million acres for the Forest Service. So there will be continued land acquisitions occurring in the foreseeable future.
For the edification of other members of the committee too, a lot of this, and I think you alluded to it, is due to the fact that frequently the federal government will have a very valuable piece of land near an urban center, for example, and the way that the lands are exchanged is that the local community or the developer, whoever it is, will put together an exchange whereby large acreages will be added to a forest, let's say, someplace, or the BLM in exchange for that very valuable, equally valuable, very small parcel.
That's correct. These exchanges are not an acre-for-acre basis. Right. It's a value a value-based system whereby you could be acquiring more acres than you're giving up in the exchange because the land you're giving up is valued as being greater value.
Thank you. Can you put any kind of a time period on the acquisition? You say the trend is to acquire more. For example, this 11.8 million, is that over about what period of time?
That's an undetermined period of time.
Okay. But one would conclude then that, that the trend is for more, not less acquisition. There is more acquisition on the books. Is there any large disinvestment plan, not disinvestment, disposal of federal lands plan that you are aware of?
Not that we're aware of. We don't have that information.
At least nothing in inquiring of the agencies. When you learned of the additional acquisitions that were going to be made, you didn't learn on the other side of the ledger a great deal of disposal of lands.
No, that information wasn't available. And here again, I think the question there might be it's undetermined as to what you're going to get in exchange for the lands you may be giving up until the exchange actually occurs.
But in recent cases, much of that is more land acquired by the federal government in exchange for more valuable land, but a smaller amount. Can you characterize that as a general statement of the nature in which perhaps the majority of these trades or exchanges occur?
We have some data from fiscal 94 and 95. In BLM's case, in fiscal 94, they acquired 135,000 acres and gave up 75,000. In fiscal 95, they acquired 106,000 acres and gave up 139,000. The Forest Service in 94 acquired 75,800 and gave up 42,000. So
I'm sorry, gave up how much?
42,000.
42. So they tend to be getting more than they're giving up in most cases.
That's correct.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's very helpful, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Bingaman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hill, let me just ask you to refer to page 12 of your report. Figure 1.1.
This is the January 1995 report?
Yes, the one that your testimony relates to.
Yes.
Now, as I read this, it shows you've got a chart there that shows the amount of land held or managed by the 4 agencies during this 30-year period.
Yes, sir.
And tell me if I'm misreading this, but the way I see it, from 1984 through the year 1993, the end of that year, I guess, this shows that there was essentially during that period no increase in Forest Service land managed. Is that correct?
It's about 5 million acres.
Yeah, but it's not a significant increase.
That's correct.
Compared to the 200 million that they otherwise manage. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There is no increase during that same 10-year period in the lands managed by Fish and Wildlife Service. Is that right?
You're looking 84
From
forward?
84 on, it looks relatively stable, yes.
There's no increase in the lands managed by the National Park Service during that 10-year period.
That is essentially correct.
And there is a significant decrease in the amount of lands managed by the BLM, which is the Alaska land transfer that you earlier referred to.
That's correct.
So over the last decade, there has not been a substantial increase in federal management of land by any agency, any of these 4 agencies at least, as far as I can determine. Is that accurate?
That would be correct.
Also, the 11 million planned acres of acquisition that you referred to, my understanding is that land is only acquired by these agencies when the Congress appropriates funds for the acquisition. Is that not right? And none of that 11,000, essentially, is going to be acquired by any agency unless we put money in an appropriation bill that is earmarked for that acquisition. Is that not right?
Well, that is essentially correct. There is the issue of exchanges.
Oh, yes, I understand that they can do an equal value exchange with a state or with a private individual.
That's correct. But in that equal value exchange, you might acquire additional acreage.
Right. You might give up land that is less valuable per acre than the land you're obtaining.
That is correct.
But as far as purchasing property, there's no purchasing going to take place unless Congress appropriates the money.
That's correct.
That would be correct.
And that would mean increased appropriations for at least one of these agencies.
Yes, sir.
You have no reason to believe that's going to happen, do you?
That is better answered by members of this committee and the Congress.
Okay. That's all I had, Mr. Chairman.
What, just to follow on that a second, and you're not really into the financial part, but if this amount of management responsibility remains there and the budget goes down, how do you expect that to be fixed?
How do I expect that?
The budget has tended to go down for these agencies over the last several years and likely will continue to be less. If the management responsibility remains the same, how do you see that difference being made up?
Well, it's not going to be made up easily. And in a lot of instances where you're still creating additional parks, additional historic sites, and these agencies are being asked to manage these facilities with essentially flat or slightly decreased budgets, it's putting a strain on these facilities. Yeah. And the parks and the forests and some other of these facilities are starting to show the effects.
Yeah. I think this is one of the questions that we really have to deal with here. It's not entirely an ideological thing. It's the Park Service, for instance, is like billions of dollars behind in maintenance. And so if you're going to have a finite amount of resources, I think you begin to look at the whole resource management question and say, where are your priorities? And that's, I think, part of what we're beginning to try and deal with here in an overall management kind of a way. Senator Clary.
And if I might add, at the same time, you have an increasing demand on the part of the public to use these facilities, the parks and the wildlife areas that are designated, the recreation areas. So it's a very complex, difficult issue.
It is indeed, and that's exactly what we're seeking to address. Senator Craig.
Mr. Chairman, you've touched an important issue. I think both sides of the aisle have some blame to place at their own feet on the question of discretionary funding versus entitlements. And I find it almost hypocritical as we constantly acquire more public land for the purpose and recognize that it needs to be managed in some instances, and we need to operate and maintain facilities that have to be dealt with in the sense of public safety and quality, that we are progressively defunding it in the name of not cutting entitlement spending. That's exactly what we've done here for the last decade. I know, I've watched it very closely, and I've been sensitive to it because discretionary dollars are extremely more valuable to my state, which is a large public land state, than our entitlement dollars. And yet it is interesting that this administration chooses to cut most of its cuts in discretionary and leave the entitlement alone. And that's part of the reason we're in the fundamental battle we're in over the budget right now, but it is an important issue. We cannot continue to defund discretionary, which handles Park Service and U.S. Forest Service and Interior, all in the name of the entitled programs. Now, Mr. Chairman, just to bring this into perspective, I thought it was interesting. 34 million acres of acquisition in 30 years. Let me put it in perspective for you. That means the acquisition of the entire states of Vermont, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maryland, Hawaii, and Connecticut. So in other words, the federal government has literally acquired that much land in the last 30 years. That ought to help everybody say, oh, well, it's only 34 million acres. Well, it was almost the whole of the eastern seaboard. The 11.8 million that you suggest are on file, that agencies are attempting to acquire, and the Senator from New Mexico is just right, most of them can't be acquired unless, well, the federal government, we, the Congress, okays it, and some are land exchanges. But that's the whole state of Maryland and Massachusetts, or the whole states of New Hampshire and New Jersey. So it is important to put this in perspective. We're not talking about a few acres here and a few acres there. We are talking about very large chunks of property that literally consume whole states. Section 3 of your report addresses federal land encumberment for conservation purposes by legislative and administrative restrictions. GAO lists several discrete land use categories of withdrawals, but I'm not sure they tell the whole story. For instance, data provided to us by the Forest Service on suitable timberland available for management shows a reduction of 59% in acreage over the past 10 years. The vast majority of these acres were encumbered through administrative decisions such as new management restrictions, interim policies, new scientific assessments, and the like. Some of these were meant to be only temporary, but have in fact remained in effect for numbers of years. I suspect there may be similar restrictions on rangelands and other resource types as well. Could you analyze in your next work all of the lands affected by either permanent or long-term temporary management restrictions that really change the very character of the land use itself outside of policy being directed by the Congress? Is that possible to do, Mr. Hill?
Yes, Mr. Craig, it's very possible. In fact, for the work that we have ongoing for the House Committee on Resources, we will be addressing many of the issues that you're bringing up. But we'd certainly like to work with you and your staff if you have some additional information you'd like.
Well, I think that's also important to understand when we talk about the land and its use and how the agencies are managed. That is a subtlety that in the western states that are highly dependent on public timber, when you take 59% of the public timber, the lands that could yield that timber, out of the timber base, you significantly change the economy of a region. And of course that's what we know has happened, but it isn't just the ownership pattern as much as it can be policy, and oftentimes it has ended up being administrative other than legislative. And I think being able to understand that and see those nuances would be extremely valuable. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there further questions? Senator.
Go ahead, Chairman. Well, all right.
I did have a question, but go ahead.
I had three other
Oh, wait a minute, I'm losing control here. Senator Kyle.
Chairman, the senator from New Mexico chose a 10-year period and asked you in the last 10 years. I note from the report that the majority of the acquisitions are actually within a 15-year period. 1979, 1980 was when a couple of the really big acquisitions occurred. Is that correct? Your report on page 11 talks about the major transfers of land from BLM to Forest Service occurred in 1979 and 80.
The major transfers from BLM to the other three agencies occurred starting in basically 74 and ran through 84.
All right. Well, but page 11 says the basic ones were 79 and 80, right? I mean, I guess the bottom line here is you can pick out any period of time. In the last, let's take the period the Senator from New Mexico used, the last 10 years. Has there been a net decrease or net increase in the amount of land the federal government owns?
Well, here again, it depends the period you're talking. In our statement, we used a 30-year period, and certainly during that 30-year period, there actually has been a net decrease. But if you consider that there were two unique land exchanges involved there involving Alaska, and you don't consider those two exchanges, then there's been a net increase.
Right. In the last 10 years, though, there's been a net increase, correct?
No, I can't say there has been a net increase in the last 10 years.
You can't say
if you include the Alaska transfers, I can't say there has been a net.
Well, when were the Alaska transfers?
The Alaska transfers are actually continuing. That evolved. It was originally set up in the Act and with a specific target number of acres that were to be transferred, and those acres are continuing to be transferred. The total acreage transfer is not even complete yet.
If you exclude them, has there been an increase or decrease?
If you would exclude them, there would be an increase.
Okay. You listed 23 new parks, 50 new historical sites, 192 new refuges.
Could I just ask you to clarify, what was that last answer you gave? You said if you excluded the Alaska transfers, there would be an increase in the last 10 years. Is that what you said?
Oh, in the last 10 years?
Yes.
I really don't have that breakdown. I'm sorry.
Well, I thought that was a question I asked you when I showed you this chart. And the answer was that there's been no increase in the last 10 years. And
Well,
there's
Mr.
been
Chairman, and if the Senator with New Mexico would just yield a second, I think the answer was not appreciable if you're comparing 5 million acres to 200 million acres, but I think there's been an increase. It just may not be characterized as appreciable. Is that not correct?
I have to apologize. We don't have with us right now a breakdown year by year, so I really can't provide that information. And what I don't have is a breakdown of the Alaska transfer acreage, which is still, like I say, continuing to occur. I don't know how much of that occurred during the last 10-year period.
According to your chart here, it all occurred during the last 10-year period. And in fact, it all occurred from 84 to 89.
That is correct, but I thought the question was if you exclude the Alaska transfer, is there a net increase or decrease? That I can't tell you. I don't have that information with me. I'd be
I think
happy.
that'd be a good thing for us to get, Mr. Chairman.
Can you provide that
Certainly.
after the hearing?
With regard to the new parks, historical sites, and refuges, do you have a time period within which those were acquired, or can you break that down, let's say, in the last 10, 15 years? Or
Between 64 and 94. We can't break it.
can you just indicate generally whether more of them were more recently, or most of those might have been in the...
I don't have that information on hand. We have it for the last 30-year period. Here again, we can provide it as best we can on a year-by-year or 5-year basis, whatever information we have available, and we could provide that for the record.
If you will.
I just wanted to ask, Mr. Chairman, Senator Craig was asking some questions about all of the different states that the federal government could have acquired. Now, this is 32 million, is that the right figure for the total amount of increase in federal land acquired in the 30 years? Was it 30?
34 million.
34 million. So I understand your testimony, though, all but 10.8 million of that was acquired from other federal agencies.
No, what we said was we've accounted for 10.8 or 9 million that was acquired from other agencies. There's an additional 23 million that we really can't account for at this time.
Well, on
In
page
terms of how that
5
land was acquired.
On page 5 of your testimony here, I think this is your testimony, says preliminary agency information shows that over this 30-year period, the 4 agencies acquired title to over 10.8 million acres of land from non-federal parties. I would assume that that means the rest of the 34 million was acquired from federal parties.
When Mr. Hill was speaking earlier, we talked about possibilities, and that's one possibility, that there were some transfers made from agencies like the Defense Department to one of these 4 agencies. That could be in that 23 million that we can't account for.
So you're not saying that the other 23 million is from federal parties?
No, we are not saying that. We're saying it could be, some of that could be from other federal agencies other than those 4 agencies, which would have been transferred to the control of the 4 agencies.
You do know that that other 23 million was not purchased?
According to what the agencies gave us, they didn't show it as being a purchase.
And we would have had to appropriate the money in order for it to be purchased, right?
Presumably so, yes.
So it'd be fairly easy to track whether Congress appropriated the money.
Yes.
So we know at least that it wasn't purchased by appropriated funds. It was acquired either from federal agencies or by exchange or by gift.
And we also know, and we mentioned this before, that there were certain lands that were not accounted for by any agency because they were being jointly managed at the 64 period. And then sometime between 64 and 84, one of those agencies became the sole manager and picked up that acreage as part of its
And that would be a
managed acreage. And that
transfer
would
from
be-
a federal entity or a federal agency.
That would come from one of the 4.
Right.
I mean, it would have been
Right.
accounted for by one of the 4.
Right.
That's correct.
Senator Bingham.
Let me suggest that if you don't know the answer, and let's not pursue it, and perhaps you can get the answer. We're all speculating here, aren't we, as where the 20 million came from?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I don't know what percentage it would be, but obviously the situation I gave a moment ago, for example, in the Potlatch Land Exchange, the Forest Service got a lot more, I mean, the Fish and Wildlife Service got a lot more than it gave up.
Sure.
And with this land exchange Senator Nichols and Senator Inhofe and I are working on, same situation. We're getting about 182,000 acres in exchange for no money changes hands. That's just additional acres.
There's a difference between value and acreage, and they could be. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. We appreciate it very much, and if you'll respond to those several questions that are still out there, why, we'd like to welcome our next panel, please. Welcome, Ms. Secretary. Nice to have you here. Appreciate your coming. Chief Thomas, nice to have you again, sir. Getting to be a common...
Well, it's been a week or two.
Yeah, I know. We missed a week there. I don't know how that happened. Any event. I'm not sure, Mr. Secretary, that you were here. Let me just, for a little direction here, indicate that our hope was, our real direction here is to take a look at levels and trends of ownership of federal land management, the need to prioritize, or the opportunity or the necessity of prioritizing limited resources to manage those lands, and maybe particularly the opportunity and the use of trades to block up lands for additional management. At least those were some of the principal items that we had in mind when we began. So, Mr. Secretary, we'd be glad to hear from you, sir. We'll put your total statement in and take as long as you'd like.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I appreciate very much the chance to be here with you and the committee members to discuss these issues. I'm particularly proud to be here with Jack Ward Thomas, my friend, my associate, a person for whom I have developed increasing admiration and indeed affection as I have worked together with him, and I hope he will excuse the paternal reference, but that's the way I feel about him. A word about the GAO testimony. I don't have any reason to seriously dispute the figures. I think that there are some discrepancies. They've already been discussed, and some errors are quite understandable, and I think that the BLM can assist them in sharpening those figures up. My own sense is that there's an issue here that goes a lot farther than simply columns and tables of statistics. What's happening in this Congress is we're seeing a revival of a rather old debate in the American West. And as I see the legislation introduced to begin proposing to dismantle the public lands, to convey them in various ways, I think of history because this cycle comes up about once every generation. It is reminiscent of the Sagebrush Rebellion in the 1970s when I was the governor of Arizona. It took place in the 1940s, culminating in what was known as the McCarran Holiday, when there was a big move to dismantle the public lands and get the federal government out of the land management business. It occurred in the 1920s and indeed at the turn of the century. Now, the reason I come here in a spirit of eagerness to discuss these is because I read history in this way. Each time we have had one of these debates fueled by this sense that we must dismantle the public lands and convey them and sell them off, the debate has resulted in an even deeper public commitment to the public American tradition of these lands. And it's against that historical reality that I come here pleased to engage in this discussion and to be as constructive and thoughtful as I possibly can. I think that beneath these tables and rows of statistics there's a larger issue, and that is not how much land in acres down to tenths of acres, but land for what purposes and to be used how. And my conclusion, I think justified by history and by the acts of this Congress in passing organic acts for the Park Service, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, is very clear. The American people view the public lands as a national resource for the benefit of all Americans. Now, I'm a Westerner. I grew up in a small town in the West. I grew up on the land, and it is my judgment that the overwhelming majority of Westerners feel exactly the same, that they view this as a national patrimony. I'm going to give you just one example, and then I'm going to move on to a very specific discussion, as you have invited me, Mr. Chairman. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, viewing the public domain as a place where I spent summers and falls hunting, fishing, skiing, hiking, rafting down the Grand Canyon, using my entitlement as an American, just like a citizen of any other state in this land. I asked one of my staff members today to do a little research for me, because most Westerners, like myself, have this feeling that if these lands are dismantled and sold off and conveyed, the fences are going to go up, the no trespassing signs are going to be out there, and we're going to be denied access to our heritage and our birthright. And in that sense, I asked one of my staff members to, this morning, to call up the Forbes Ranch in Colorado. This is a large ranch owned by the Forbes family, I assume including candidate Forbes, and asked what the price would be for an elk hunting tag. And I was told that on the Forbes Ranch, on this private land with a fence and no trespassing sign around it in a vast region of southern Colorado, that the price as of this morning for an elk tag is $5,500 plus $150 a day. I asked my aide to call up Colorado Game and Fish and see what a citizen of Colorado paid to go for an elk on the public domain. The price as of today is $30.25. I said, what about deer? And the Forbes Ranch people told us that they have a bargain price for deer of $2,500 and that they would gladly give out a combined elk and deer permit for $8,000. A Colorado deer tag as of this morning goes for $20.25. That's what Westerners are thinking when they hear about these proposals to chop up and barbecue the public domain. Now, I would be the first to acknowledge that the configuration of public lands in the West is very much the product of many different historical circumstances and events, and that no one can tell you that the configuration of public lands is what it ought to be. When I became governor of Arizona, I took a look at the land holdings of my state of Arizona and said, I know we can do better. So I sat down with Stan Turley, the Republican president of the Arizona State Senate, called in sportsmen, land users, went to the Secretary of the Interior, who was then Jim Watt. He directed me in turn to the State Director of the Bureau of Land Management, who was then Dean Bibles. And we nailed this map of Arizona to the wall and said, okay, we ought to rationalize these holdings and try to figure out what makes sense for all users and all parties, because we knew that there are all kinds of isolated in-holdings that had come out of checkerboard railroad grants, that had come out of the preemption acts, out of mining locations, out of the Timber and Stone Culture Act, out of all kinds of public land conveyances. And as we put this map of Arizona up, we very rapidly saw some things that we could all agree on very quickly. We decided that we ought to consolidate in holdings, and that we ought to move the public domain toward places where we could manage land primarily for its recreational and wildlife values. The Arizona Strip, the Mojave Desert in western Arizona, and the high upland valleys in southeastern Arizona. And at the end of a 4-year period, we had swapped approximately 3 million acres of lands among state, federal, and private parties. What we found was that the laws really worked very well. There were very few impediments to getting these blocking up exchanges done. We did find that it took an enormous specific commitment from the state director of the Bureau of Land Management, the other federal agencies, the personal involvement of the governor, and a firm consensus among all the parties. We found that any one party could probably torpedo the whole thing. When we got the parties together, it went. And in that process, we literally changed the face of public land ownership in Arizona. That's a personal experience that I had as the governor of Arizona. It is a process that I would be happy to enter into with any governor in the West at any time, because these laws work. These exchanges are possible. Now, in a spirit of inquiry, I'd like to mention 3 specific exchanges that I think illustrate how the laws work and how it is we can get together, step away from all of the rhetoric and these endless studies, and get down in the dirt and find solutions. During the course of the process that I just told you about in the 1980s in Arizona, we discovered that the Tenneco Corporation owned a Spanish land grant, which was a long, linear piece of land on both sides of the San Pedro River in southeastern Arizona. Happens to be the last free-flowing Sonoran Desert river in the United States. The land grant, about 50,000 acres, extends for some 30-plus miles along the San Pedro River. At the same time, it turned out that the BLM had a large block of land on the western suburban fringes of Phoenix that really ought to have gone into development. And in very short order, the Tenneco Corporation, through an intermediary, conveyed title to the San Pedro River for the Bureau of Land Management and took title to approximately 5,000 acres of BLM land in the path of growth of Phoenix. Now, by the criteria you're using here today, that was a terrible idea because it was about a 10-to-1 ratio. The BLM land holdings increased by about 40,000 acres. 50,000 minus 5 actually be 45,000 acres. And in the tenor of the inquiry here today, that would be deemed, I sense, something not desirable. But the bottom line is that the San Pedro Conservation Area is now established by act of Congress, supported by every single member of the Arizona delegation. The land in West Phoenix is developing. Its value in the tax base has gone up again, again, and again. So out of that, we get an extraordinary new conservation area by consensus of Arizonans. The tax base in Arizona has gone up like that, and Phoenix now has space to develop. Those kinds of opportunities exist all over the West. But my point is they can be done under existing law. One more Arizona example. This one, interestingly enough, resulted in a net decrease in public land holdings in Arizona. This one was put together by my predecessors in the Reagan administration and by Congressman Udall in Arizona. What it amounted to was the exchange of 200 acres in the very heart of Phoenix for development for 150,000 acres in the Big Cypress Preserve in Florida. Now, I spent yesterday in the middle of the Big Cypress Preserve down in Florida, and it is the heart of the entire South Florida system. This system is more pristine, it is more varied than the Everglades itself. There's not a person in Florida who thinks that's a bad idea. And the Collier family, in exchange, took several hundred acres of land at the intersection of Central and Indian School in Phoenix, which is now, again, the tax base has gone up like that. And it was done across the entire nation for the benefit of every single party. Now, in terms of current exchange issues, I would direct your attention to another and final illustrative example that I think suggests that these crusades, these ideological crusades to sort of fillet and hand out the public lands are misguided, comes from Nevada, where some years ago, Jim Santini from Nevada and Phil Burton from California saw a problem and an opportunity. The problem was that Las Vegas needed land for growth, surrounded by BLM land. The opportunity was that both Nevada and California wanted to start purchasing land in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And again, anybody who's been in that basin, anyone from California or Nevada knows what the issue is. There simply must be, and had to be, more open space to prevent the collapse of that entire ecosystem. Burton and Santini got together, drew a square around Las Vegas, passed a piece of legislation now known as the Burton-Santini Act, authorized the Bureau of Land Management to sell the discrete parcels of land within the red line of the Burton-Santini legislation, bank the proceeds, and apply it to the purchase of inholdings in the Tahoe Basin located in both California and Nevada. What that adds up to, I think, is that we can do a better job of land management and land tenure patterns in the West and indeed in the entire United States. But we must step away from this crusade to dismantle the public domain. I believe what we should do is move this discussion down to a state-by-state process of engagement where we can find these opportunities, subject to the appropriation power of Congress and to your oversight. I think the resource advisory councils that we have established by regulation this past year in the western states are an ideal forum to start the process of discussion, to bring together environmentalists, resource users, public officials, and the governors. But whatever the forum, I'm certain that that's the most productive route. And speaking as Secretary of the Interior, I would be only too happy to, with your engagement, begin that process starting today. Thank you.
Chief Thomas, please.
Yes, sir. I'm glad to be here. It's been about a week, and I was needing a fix. But my focus will be on the GAO report detailing patterns in land ownership, federal land ownership by Federal Land Management Agency. That report, that the GAO reports a number of acres in the National Forest System has grown less than 3%, from 186 million acres in 64 to 191 million in 93, an increase of about 5,251,000 acres. Our National Forest System is in about 4 broad categories. The National Forests that cover about 187.6 million acres, the National Grasslands and Land Utilization Projects covering 3.9 million acres, research and experimental acres of about 65,000, and administrative sites and other small properties of less than 10,000. Most of the national forest, about 154 million acres, was reserved from the public domain and set aside as national forest. Most of the remaining 37 million acres were acquired by purchase, donation, exchange, or interagency transfer, most before 1964. About 25 million of those acres are located east of the 100th meridian, where little public domain existed. Impetus for national forest in the east developed between 1905 and 1908 as a result of taking over some very badly treated land. To respond to this, Congress enacted the Weeks Act in 1911, providing for purchase of lands in watersheds on the heads of navigable streams for watershed protection, timber production, and authorized designating those lands as national forest. Most of the purchases for the Weeks Act occurred before 1941. The 3.9 million acres of the national grasslands and land utilization projects were acquired under the provisions of Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act of '37. About 11.3 million acres of Dust Bowl lands were acquired. Of those, some 3.4 million are now designated as national grasslands. Between 1963 and 94, acreage held in fee title increased by 2.8%, or about 5,251,000 acres, to its current 191 million acres. Of these acres, almost 1 million resulted from transfers from other federal agencies, primarily the Bureau of Land Management, more than 500,000 acquired through gifts and donations, and some 3.5 million acres of that growth resulted from 1.5 million acres of purchase and 2 million acres of land exchange, the vast majority on a willing seller basis. In the western states where federal land ownership is highest, expansion of the national forest system has been very small. In the 6 western regions, excluding Alaska, holdings have grown by approximately 1.3% over the period in question. In Alaska, acreage increased by 6.8%, but almost totally by transfers from other federal agencies. Acreage in the east has grown by about 8.3% over the same period. Even so, there's only about 22 million acres of national forest in the east. Although 2 million acres have been added through land exchange, expansion of the system was not the primary purpose. Historically, land exchange has been used to consolidate fragmented ownership, and most of the western national forests were reserved from public domain lands. The United States granted land to the railroads and states within proclaimed boundaries of the national forest, and the resulting checkerboard patterns have essentially been a nightmare, greatly complicating efficient management. Exchanges most typically acquired lands as part of the Wild and Scenic River and National Scenic Trail corridors, wilderness areas, threatened and endangered species habitat, and special ecological areas. In most cases, the private party acquired lands that were better suited for development or for commodity production, therefore enhancing economic activity in the local community. The Forest Service typically acquires less accessible lands in exchange for lands more suitable for development or for specific economic use. As land exchanges must be of equal value, the Forest Service typically exchanges smaller tracts worth more per acre for larger tracts that are worth less. So even though the value of the national forest system has not changed appreciably, the number of acres has increased. For fiscal years 90 through 94, we completed 642 transactions, acquiring 500,000 acres of non-federal land in exchange for 325,000 acres of Forest Service land, an increase of about 175,000. Since 1965, the Land and Water Conservation Fund financed almost all the land purchases, about 1.5 million acres, with 75% of these purchases being in the east. Purchases in the west, less than 500,000 acres, is 0.5% of the holdings in those states, even less if you include Alaska. The Forest Service may acquire interest in lands restricting use to varying degrees. Interest in 175,000 acres have been acquired through condemnation. 110,000 acres are on a willing sell-in basis. That condemnation has been almost exclusively used to clear title or to set a price argued between the government and the seller. These easements were generally for lands in congressionally designated areas such as wild and scenic rivers or national recreation areas. These instruments are very difficult and expensive to administer, and their use has declined substantially. The exception is the Forest Legacy Program, enacted as part of the 1990 Farm Bill. It's cooperative between the Forest Service and state and regional authorities to acquire lands and interest in lands for conservation purposes. Through Forest Legacy, the Forest Service has acquired fee title to 1,660 acres and easements on 3,694 acres in Maine, New York, and Vermont. Clearly, the National Forest System has grown less than 3% over 30 years. Over half results from interagency transfers and land exchange. Acquisitions were to enhance agency efficiency by rationalizing ownership pattern, not expanding the land base. The purchase program acquires lands with significant values best protected through federal ownership. Historically, purchases have been made most extensively in the East, where federal land ownership is relatively low. That concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chief. Mr. Secretary, you weren't here, I don't think, when the governor from Wyoming spoke. I'm not sure he would agree with your assessment of the trades. He indicated that that is not going well, that there has not been an effort there. How, can we tell him that you now are prepared to do that?
I believe that it should be possible to work out blocking and consolidation trades in everybody's interest, and the answer is yes.
But that hasn't happened.
Well, I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, that it can happen. The trades that I have described, and we have made some, I think, Senator Bumpers described some of the trades that have gone on, and I see no reason why this can't be the pattern, because we have an extraordinary record of making them happen.
I agree with you entirely, and you can see the Wyoming pattern right over there on that map, and certainly management would be better for whomever manages it if we could block that up. The fact is we've worked on it pretty hard from our standpoint, and quite frankly, it hasn't happened. But I'm hopeful that it will.
My own, if I may, Mr. Chairman, my own sense as I look at the map of Wyoming is the great opportunity are the school sections, because you can see the whole state just absolutely peppered with the 4 sections per township. Now, we've had some interesting experience in the West. I described my experience. Scott Matheson, when he was governor of Utah, took a run at this and came up with a concept called Project Bold, which he finally brought to the Congress and which is now being executed in Utah. The difficulty in Utah, and I point this out to you because I think it has some significant possibilities for Wyoming. The difficulty in Utah was that it wasn't obvious. The state wasn't certain that it saw federal lands that really fit its development future. So Congress authorized us to exchange mineral rights for the school sections. And that process is now taking place, authorized by Congress on a statewide basis in Utah. It's going very well.
One of the other efforts is, in total, it's likely, at least your department over time has had some reduction. And how do you propose to continue to set priorities for a finite amount of resources as those demands increase?
Senator, I think it's a fair question. We have made a number of proposals to the Congress. You mentioned earlier with the last witness this issue of the National Park Service. The administration has now proposed for 3 years concession reform and flexibility to raise admission fees to be kept within the park system for maintenance and infrastructure. If we could get real concession form and the authority on a selective, thoughtful basis to keep fee increases in the park, I think we could go a long ways, and I'm just absolutely certain that the American public supports that. I don't think there's any question about it.
And we supported that. You indicated, and that we should work together. I hope we do that, and maybe ought to do something about the rhetoric. I'm told that there is no congressional proposal to close any national park.
Senator, there is a proposal called the Park Closure Commission.
There is no proposal to close a national park before the Congress. Is that right?
There is on the list are 260 units of the national park system, including all of the national seashores, all of the national monuments. Specifically exempted are only the 54 units who have the word park in their names, but it does not include monuments, the national seashores, historical
Frankly,
sites,
Mr.
Independence
Secretary,
Hall.
that's not my question. You come up here and you talk about, and you want to work together, and you say in your press release yesterday that this is being replaced instead by a dangerous ideology driven by narrow interests which would result in national heritage being placed on the auction block. I'm simply asking you, and I'm told that there is no proposal to closing the national park.
I stand by that statement, and
There is none, right?
there is.
There is none.
If
You know, if
it
we're going
has-
to have a conversation, we have to start with some of the things that are really...
Well, Senator, I have always, in my statement, said units of the national park system. The proposal applies to approximately 260 units of the national park system. It exempts 54 parks like
It just
Yellowstone.
makes it difficult to look forward of management with that kind of, you know, rhetoric, and I don't know quite why you do that, unless you're looking for headlines here today, perhaps.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
But we're looking to solve some questions, and that's what it's all about. Mr. Craig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Babbitt and Chief Thomas, thank you both for being with us today. I've always appreciated the candidness and the frankness of Chief Thomas. We've worked on a lot of issues over the last 12 months to try to winnow out some of the issues I think that concern a great deal of citizens across our country about the general management of the Forest Service and the specific management in some areas, and I thank you for that. Mr. Secretary, if you came to the Hill today spoiling for a headline, I'll make every effort not to give you one, because what I would like to do is work with you. But I must correct the record. There is not a piece of legislation on the Hill to sell off any public land. And for you to come before us and to use rhetoric about sell-off and dismantlement is not only not in good faith and good trust, it is factually invalid. You go check the congressional record. If you can find one piece of legislation introduced to sell off public lands, then I'll apologize to you in public. But to my knowledge today, that doesn't exist. What does exist is something very close to what you're proposing, Mr. Secretary. A relationship, a dialogue. Most importantly, trying to solve some of those problems that have plagued especially public land states like your state of Arizona or my state of Idaho. Conrad Burns and I proposed a commission. Now that ought to be something you could agree with, because that would talk about the kind of legislative proposal that would invite the dialogue that you have welcomed. It does not mention the sell-off of lands. I'm a Westerner too, Mr. Secretary. I am extremely proud of our public land heritage. It is not only a national passion in my state, but it is a state passion that these lands remain public, that they remain available to the public, and that they be managed in wise and environmentally sound ways. But it is not necessarily a passion that they be managed by the federal government. And if you are talking about dismantling a national heritage only if it is bestowed by the presence of a national management agency and not by a state management agency, then we have issue to talk about. But let us deal in good faith. Your political rhetoric and your campaign style does not serve this committee well today. And it will not serve the proper formation of public policy. There is not a member of this committee that wants to sell off 1 acre of public land. But there are a good many of us that would like to see the balance of public and private land at least maintained in some western states like Idaho, so that we don't dilute the tax base. Your examples of tax increases in landlocked properties is a valid one. But it comes after tremendously energetic efforts. The land exchange that Senator Bumpers spoke of, I was aggressively involved in, as was the senator. Public lands in Idaho became private, and private lands in Arkansas became public, and both states benefited. Idaho has a 61.9% federal land base. Arkansas has a 9%. So let us deal in good faith. You and I once had a very important dialogue about mining law. You now call it a sham. I'm saddened by that. Saddened because we could sell the surface domain when it was appropriately acquired through the processes that you would manage for fair market value. We could, for the first time, establish a hard rock royalty. There are a lot of positive things that we could do, but it isn't going to happen now. And therefore, it gives you the platform to go to Wall Street and hold great public press conferences. And the public hurts, because you must administer the law as it is without cooperating with us on changing the law in a productive way. That's, you know, I guess I'm disappointed. I thought you and I were going to get a mining law. But that dialogue stopped because your public statements on the record and your private statements to me were direct opposites. Now, Mr. Secretary, the public Land West is not happy. It doesn't want the land sold off. It wants the public domain to remain public. But it wants a sensitivity of management that allows for people to have some rights. You're going to have to go a hard way, even in your own agency, to find out about all the public land management damage that you talk about that doesn't exist out there today because of environmental laws that have been passed by this Congress that most of us support, at least in theory. So I guess I'm terribly frustrated when you come before us. I've had a marvelous dialogue with the U.S. Forest Service looking at alternative approaches. That's what's important, that we examine where we are and where we ought to get. I'm very fearful that your rhetoric tells me that it should have been delivered at the National Press Club and not before the Energy and Natural Resources Committee of the United States Senate. I don't know if I have any questions, but I'd love to take you up on your offer. And I assume that a commission concept like Conrad Burns and I talked about and others have supported, or the kind of dialogue that you're talking about, maybe with Western states' governors, would be extremely valuable for all of us to benefit from. I'd love to help facilitate that with no preconceived concepts other than that we get together and try to resolve some of our management areas, even if it only came to the blocking of land and then the fair exchanges of land. That would go a long way toward solving some of our management problems. Because the checkerboard pattern in your state or in my state, it has always been an issue, and it ebbs and flows. Mr. Chairman, I have only one other comment. We're going to have a vote here in a few moments, and I know the senator from Arizona has some comments to make, but let me address this one to Chief Thomas. Jack, I have before me a set of 3 public service announcements cut by the U.S. Forest Service starring Norman Schwarzkopf. I find it interesting that they are being aired as a test market trial in the Boise market. I also find it coincidentally interesting that they are being aired at the same time that the Idaho legislature is debating a resolution of a state proposal, a concept not unlike Secretary Babbitt's general concepts of a few moments ago, where the state would seek authority to manage some federal land in Idaho or exchange certain management talents that they have for other that the Forest Service doesn't have. It was interesting to watch the media coverage of your PSAs. They were believed to have been put there for lobbying purposes, and I have the tape of those media coverages, and I'd like to have you look at it. Because the coincidence is something that I can't pass go on. The PSAs are beautiful. The Forest Service in Idaho has an excellent reputation of management in most instances. But at a time when the states, Western states, are talking about alternative approaches, to not selling off the public lands, but managing the public lands. And it's a responsible and reasonable dialogue that we should all engage in. Along comes a PSA in a very timely fashion that literally puts it down. And if I could use the phrase, you use the biggest gun available to put it down. Take a look at it.
Can I reply?
Yes, of course.
I have seen it. It has been withdrawn.
Thank you.
The people that did it were told that it was an inappropriate use of the Forest Service logo. And I apologize. It was an inappropriate thing to do. It better have been stopped. And I think I have in my possession all the copies of that tape.
Not all of them.
You got one.
You can have this one.
But it was put forward as a test. We did not clear it. I mark it off as to maybe a little bit too much enthusiasm. I think we were wrong.
Chief, thank you. Thank you very much. Because I don't believe it would have taken much of a stretch of the imagination to suggest that this was lobbying. It should not be.
You're correct.
And you've obviously recognized that, and you've done exactly what I was just going to ask you to do, to withdraw those until such time as they were appropriately handled. Federal agencies shouldn't be lobbying. Mr. Secretary, we learned differently this year when we saw the BLM openly lobbying a piece of legislation that never became law. I'm glad that the Forest Service has the integrity to recognize it when it comes along and act accordingly. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Senator Kyle? We're going to have a vote.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I really don't have a question, just a brief statement. I want to express, first of all, appreciation to Chief Thomas. I know that he was not in charge at the time, but I mentioned a situation much earlier regarding the little town of Payson. The Forest Service had to increase the fees. They were too low. When they increased the fees, the school couldn't afford to pay them anymore. And while the Forest Service had to take an official position at that time, not particularly helpful to the acquisition of the land through what amounted to a lease purchase arrangement, nevertheless, it stood back and allowed the Congress to acquire the small piece of Forest Service land in a way that suggested to me a real degree of flexibility and cooperation. And I'll never forget the fact that the Forest Service was willing to be flexible, willing to be helpful, even though it couldn't come right out and positively support our legislation. It allowed it to happen, and in the end, it was really a win-win situation for everybody. The Forest Service continues to enjoy a great reputation in that area. They now have a school that they can pay for, and really everybody's happy. And I think one of the things that suggests is that when we talk about either acquiring or disposing of land, flexibility is really the key. And Secretary Babbitt, let me compliment you. Your comments about the exchange of land, both those exchanges which you effected when you were governor and also what you've offered to do here, demonstrate the need for flexibility here, because you can't just be on a binge to buy land or to sell land and to hold what you have necessarily. I think that also, however, should be applied with a greater degree of enthusiasm to some of the problems not of disposal or acquisition of land, but of the way the land is managed because of the requirements of the Endangered Species Act or limitations imposed by wilderness area or wild and scenic rivers. There's always an exception that proves the rule, and I think we have to be, just keep that little example that I mentioned before in mind, that flexibility and working together in cooperation obviously is going to be a whole lot better than being hidebound. I also want to make a couple other comments about your testimony, Secretary Babbitt. I agree with your characterization generally of the importance of public lands. I think every one of us here from land states would agree with that. And but I also want to make the point, I don't think anybody is criticizing the exchanges of unequal acreages for equal value. I think we all appreciate the importance of that, and I know I was criticized in Arizona for wanting to sell valuable Arizona land for swampland in Florida, but it was a win-win. You're right. We enhanced the Everglades, and we also solved a problem there in Phoenix, so it can be a win-win. But I just have to conclude, I think, that the testimony of the GAO would suggest that some of the statements that you made are really a little overblown. You spoke of, and this isn't exact quote, but a grave threat of mass sell-off of public lands or maybe even a giveaway. And you said a moment ago that there was a crusade to dismantle the public domain, and that was an exact quote, a crusade to dismantle the public domain. I know that there is some rhetoric like that in parts of the West, that there are a lot of intemperate statements being made by a lot of frustrated folks, but they are very much a minority. They will not drive the Congress to do anything like that. And I really don't think it serves the purpose of cooperation to speak in those terms when, as we had the testimony here, just within the last generation, we've had 34 million more acres added to the public lands. We've got 11.8 million more to be acquired in the near future with no knowledge on the part of GAO about any significant amount to be disposed of. 23 new parks, 50 new historical sites, 192 refuges. 94 and 95, the numbers are all up. So it seems to me that to so characterize it is really to misstate the situation. Perhaps just as some of the folks out west are prone to misstate the situation on occasion. And I would just urge all of us to speak with a little more precision and try to work together in the spirit that I discussed in my early comment.
Mr. Chairman, could I make a comment about the GAO of giving up any land while you're acquiring? In the Forest Service's case, we have about 4 million acres targeted under priority for acquisition. Given the status of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, any part of that, almost all of any of that would be in land exchange. I would assume we would probably end up giving our record more land. We'd give up less and get more, but the value of the land that we would give up would be equal. So in terms of that 4 million acquisition, we have a very firm idea of what those acquisitions would be. We have a very firm idea that we would probably not acquire that in fee simple through purchase, but through land exchange. What the exact trade would be, I don't know, but there would be a trade.
Well, gentlemen, we thank you. We'd like to work very much with you. I think it's a critical time as we move into another century with our resources, particularly those in the West. And there are a number of alternatives before us. I hope we choose those that are best and want to work with you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here.
Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Chief.
Yes, sir. Sean, thank you.
Hearing is adjourned.
Yeah, I would say that he got